This video, we'll be talking about dissociative identity disorder, personality disorders, as well as somatoform disorders. In previous videos, we talked about schizophrenia, anxiety disorders, formerly anxiety disorders of obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder. We also talked about mood disorders, specifically major depressive disorder and bipolar disorders. So for today, let's start with dissociative identity disorder, which gets us to um, just a general category of disorders that we now call just dissociative disorders. Um, Dissociative disorders are characterized by a sudden loss of memory or a change in identity. These are very rare disorders. Sometimes you'll hear of a dissociative fugue state, where someone like wakes up and doesn't know who they are, and they're convinced that they're someone else, or they just don't know anything about themselves. They have almost like complete amnesia. If you've ever seen the TV show Breaking Bad, there's references to a fugue state that take place. I think it's in season one, but that go into kind of the idea behind coming to in an area that you don't know anything about. In Those are dissociative disorders in general. Specifically, we should talk a little bit about dissociative identity disorder. One of the things that any dissociative disorder has is it presumes repression, right? It presumes that there is something going on where your mind is just blocking itself from understanding things. So, there's a traumatic past or traumatic experience that then leads the person to basically have what some people call a psychotic break, some people call mental break, or a dissociative break, where it becomes a separate like personality or sense of memory going forward. Again, I should reiterate that these are extremely rare disorders, way less than any of the other ones that we've talked about so far. The big one, though, is dissociative identity disorder. This is what was formerly called multiple personality disorders. If you've ever seen the movie Split, the M. Night Shyamalan movie, that follows a lot of dissociative disorders or dissociative identity disorders, and actually gets some of it right. Obviously, if you've seen the movie, I won't give any spoilers, but the part that seems fantastical but everything else is pretty close to what we know about DID. Some famous people have said that they have dissociative identity disorder. So the image in the top left is Sybil. That's the famous case from the 70s, I believe it was, where she had upwards of like 20 different personalities, and they made Sally Field played her in a movie. That's Roseanne Barr on the bottom. She's claimed to have dissociative identity disorder, as has Herschel Walker. That's former NFL player Herschel Walker, who in interviews has said that when he would go out on the field, he would become a different person and have different memories and different experiences and different thought processes than when he wasn't in his team's uniform or pads or whatever. And it got to the point where he was dissociating. He was dissociating between his quote unquote real life and the life on the field. So dissociative identity disorder is characterized by two or more distinct identities that alternately control behavior. So it's like someone's in the driving seat one day, and then the next day it's someone else. It can also switch midday. It can sometimes happen mid-conversation, although usually it's after a bout of unconsciousness. So you're just waking up from a nap or from sleeping the night before, and suddenly there's a new identity that you have. These identities don't have to be the same gender. They don't have to be the same. Basically, learned things are forgotten with these new identities. It really does appear as if there's someone else entirely new, that you have an entirely new personality and an entirely new identity than you would otherwise have. Again, there's a lot of controversy around this, because if it exists, which there's some question, if it exists, then that means that Freud was right with regards to repression, right? That that there are some things that our brains just can't handle or don't want to handle, so they repress what's going on. They disassociate from what's happening in their lives, right? They compartmentalize. Um, we think, since a lot of Freud's ideas have been, pretty much debunked, even the idea of repression, which we talked about when we were looking at post-traumatic stress. If this is something that occurs naturally, why aren't more people dissociating all the time, right? Especially in traumatic events, right? These dissociative disorders and post-traumatic stress don't seem to be able to exist if one also does. So we have to understand where this comes from, and from an evolutionary standpoint, we understand that this is kind of like an extreme version of the person situation model of personality, right? That we talked about with Walter Mischel. That in some situations we act differently than in others. This seems to be like an extreme version of that. That in some situations we actually take on a whole new personality, right? It's not just tweaking some of my idiosyncrasies on the edges. It's like, oh, I'm a completely different person. So that gets into the question, right? Does it exist? Where's the evidence here? So first off, we know that there's some hard evidence in terms of like brain scans, um, things related to like body temperature and hormone regulation, that people who have that, when they go from one personality to another, their brain waves change, their the way that their body is functioning changes. We also know that memories don't carry over, and not just memories that like you might think, like maybe someone's playing along, but things that have been conditioned, right? Things that have been classically conditioned don't carry over when identity shifts. So that is pretty good evidence, right, that this might exist. And other things too, things like handedness. Some personalities are right-handed. Some people have personalities that are left-handed, and you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know that someone was writing with their non-dominant hand because that personality is left or right-handed. So you see these body states that dramatically change. One of the things that seems to be true across all people that have dissociative identity disorder is that they had some sort of trauma, um, that there was some really bad thing that happened in their lives, whether that was sexual abuse, physical abuse, but it usually comes out of prolonged trauma, right? So not like a car crash or something that might cause trauma that's like kind of a one and done situation, but a prolonged exposure to traumatic events. Think about sexual abuse of a child or something that goes on for many years. Most Actually, almost all people that have dissociative identity disorder have some sort of traumatic past, and the thought process from our standpoint is maybe they seem to be very good at self hypnosis, right? That they can. One of the things we didn't talk about, they removed it from the curriculum. Hypnosis is its own state of consciousness. It exists. There are limits to hypnosis, but hypnosis is definitely something that exists in the field of psychology. Um, it can't be used to like remember past, repressed memories, or it can't be used to like get someone to do something they really don't want to. Um, but it does seem to be a heightened time period of what we would call suggestibility. So, you might be more inclined to do something under a hypnotic state than you would if you were not hypnotized. So people with dissociative identity disorder seem to be really good at self-hypnosis, that they can kind of, by hypnotizing themselves, they disassociate themselves from the scenario. You can imagine that someone who's on the receiving end of years of physical abuse, that they might mentally go somewhere else, right, when the abuse is happening, right? They disassociate from their body and go somewhere else mentally. Um, the literature suggests that that is how things like dissociative identity disorder starts, that they're escaping trauma, um, and then therefore like create this like alternate reality that then manifests over time into its own um, solidified identity and personality. um, so there seems to be some strong evidence on this one side that it exists, right? Different brain functioning, uh, things like classical conditioning, those things kind of appear to give evidence to dissociative identity disorder. On the other hand, we know that not all abused children display dissociative disorders or dissociative identity disorders. Um, we know that post-traumatic stress is a major critique. Just the fact that it exists is a major critique of dissociative identity disorder. We also know some other things. Um, when the DSM first included dissociative identity disorder in its diagnostic criteria, the number of people with dissociative identity disorder increased pretty quickly. Now, you might say that makes sense right now that we have specific diagnostic criteria. More people are able to find it and search, and treat it. The downside here is that it happened at such a rate that it seemed like it was being made up, right? It seemed like people were playing into this. Oh, I can just claim multiple personalities and whatever. But the other thing that increased after it was included in the DSM is the number of personalities that the average person had. Some people, initially only had a handful, right, 2 or 3, but now there's some people that have, 15, 20 different personalities, and that's not something that we really saw before the main, dissociative identity disorder became established in the DSM. So that wouldn't happen if it was something that was always there, right? That it seems like it's something that people are searching for, which we also know is the case. We know that analysts often will search for different personalities especially if they're interested in dissociative identity disorder, or if they have a specialty in that they sometimes will claim that something counts as a dissociative disorder or a different identity when it doesn't really actually meet the criteria. Another downside is, unlike all these other disorders we've talked about, it's very rare outside of North America. Even in Europe, dissociative identity disorder doesn't really exist to the same level it does in the United States and Canada, which is weird, right? Why would it exist in some parts of the world and not others if this is something that is like a natural, normal human thing, that we see with depression, even, normal, right? Just something that people experience around the world, right? Schizophrenia is global. Anxiety disorders are global. Mood disorders are global. Dissociative identity disorder seems to just be really the US and Canada. So what does that tell us about, this actually existing in the world? So how do we explain this? Well, the obvious way to explain it is through the psychoanalytic realm, right? Through Freudian's understanding that there's unacceptable impulses or trauma that someone is repressing, and then that leaks through into different personalities as ways to deal with it, right? Maybe there's a personality who is, like a bully or a tough guy or something like that, and that's the identity that they took on to deal with the trauma that was being experienced. That's a very understandable explanation, especially coming at it from a Freudian perspective, right? That seems to be what's happening, right? In the data, we see that there are people that experience trauma, prolonged trauma, and that they can sometimes develop this disorder that fits in the psychoanalytic perspective. But it's not alone. We know that from the learning perspective, right? That if me or if someone who's undergoing trauma need some escape, right? They need the trauma is so devastating that they can't deal with it. Like they just cannot mentally cope with something so severe. Then by escaping that reality, that is negative reinforcement, right? That negative thing that's happening to you, that bad thing that's happening to you, is being taken away by this, focus on it being a different person or going somewhere else in your mind or those kinds of things. Dissociating from your body. That can then be reinforced through the learning principles, which then make it more likely that you're going to do that in the future. So we cannot explain dissociative identity disorder from something besides just psychoanalysis, right? And like I said, most oftentimes it is a protective response from trauma. So let's shift gears a little bit and talk about personality disorders. We're going to do this pretty briefly. There's some handouts on Schoology that you guys should be paying attention to and reviewing. I would make sure that you have them in your notes. Really, the only one we're going to talk about here is antisocial personality disorder because it's kind of counterintuitive in terms of the name. So I want to make sure that we're clarified on that. And then the rest is up to you to get from your book and from some of the things in Schoology. So we know that a personality is one's enduring pattern of thinking, feeling, acting, right? We spent some time talking a lot about personality in the last unit. So when we talk about a personality disorder, it is someone's personality itself that is causing these kind of life interruptions, right? That it's somehow impacting someone's life, um, and that can lead to a lot of negative outcomes. So antisocial personality disorder. This is not someone who's like a loner or who doesn't like to go to parties, right? When we talk about calling someone antisocial, we often mean that as like, you're just not friendly or you're off-putting or you're a loner. For psychology, antisocial personality disorder is someone who is um, basically operating outside of society, that there's no conscience for wrongdoing, right? It's the opposite of pro-social behavior, right? Pro-social behavior is helping others. So someone who has antisocial personality disorder, oftentimes called a psychopath or sociopath, um, that they have no conscience. So they do whatever they want. They don't feel remorse. They don't feel bad. They don't feel guilt. They just do whatever they want to do. Serial killers usually have antisocial personality tendencies, but so do normal, average, everyday people. Some people are just, they don't have a conscience, and that doesn't mean that they're going to kill people or engage in horrible behaviors, but they just have they don't feel bad when they do things wrong. Um, Usually, this affects men, and usually you see signs of this before really like adolescence kicks in and teenage years start. So, the old thing about like people who torture animals as kids, right? That signifies a lack of conscience for hurting others, right? That sometimes is seen as a warning sign for antisocial personality disorder. We know that it's both biological and psychological, that being put in by doing something bad, it doesn't raise the body's response to guilt or shame or disgust or something. None of those things are there. And we also know that it's psychological, that there's a cognitive component. What's interesting is when we talk about hero versus con man, right? You can see someone with antisocial personality disorder being right, like manipulative and trying to get one over on others, but you can also see that as someone who is like the hero in a situation, right? Like think of like someone like Batman, right? Um, yes, I know he has a code; he doesn't like to kill people, but he just destroys things trying to catch like the one bad guy. Um, he doesn't really ever seem bad about like blowing up half of a city to catch the Joker or whatever. So there's some aspects of antisocial personality disorder within a lot of the heroes, right? Superman as well, like people who don't care if other people get hurt if they feel like they're doing the right thing for society, right? That there's a lack of remorse that's there. We know that there's a genetic component to antisocial personality disorder. Um, and that can then lead to the different ways that we act. I should take a point here to make. I should take a second here to make this point. Um, just because someone has a personality disorder or schizophrenia or any psychological disorder, we often think that there's this like, oh, you can say that you're crazy or temporary insanity or something and get out of a crime, right? So that someone could be a serial killer, but oh, I just have antisocial personality disorder, therefore you can't really put me in prison because I don't know that I did anything wrong. In reality, right, this is an important graph. So the public perception of people uh, pleading, making an insanity plea is about 33% of all felony cases. In fact, it's less than 1% that actual have some sort of insanity plea being entered. Um, and most insanity pleas are rejected, right? 25 less than 25% of insanity pleas uh, result in acquittal. So that's relatively low. And the other thing is, just by being acquitted doesn't mean that the person's free to go. right? We forget that there are mental hospitals, that there are psychological clinics that people can be forced to go to by law, as a result of a criminal action, civil action, really anything, that people can be, institutionalized, although not in a prison, right? But still not necessarily free to go about their daily lives. So we need to be understanding of the fact that when we talk about these disorders and how they play out in the law, that there really is this discrepancy between what we think actually happens and what does in reality. I know this video is getting a little long, but there's only like one real slide left, so I want to just get to that. And those are somatoform disorders. Somatoform disorders, also known as psychosomatic disorders, are disorders where there are physical ailments but cannot be explained by any physical cause. So maybe someone loses the ability to use an arm, maybe someone feels like they're going to get sick and therefore does, but there is no underlying physical cause, that the ultimate cause is psychological. It's important to know that people who have psychosomatic disorders or somatoform disorders are not simply faking it. They are really convinced that their arm doesn't work, so their arm doesn't work, or their leg doesn't work, or something like that. Let's talk about two specific types of psychosomatic disorders. One is called somatization disorder. This is really you believe that you have this long history of medical issues, that you're constantly going to the doctor for ailments that are completely considered normal, but you feel like it's a sign of uh, worse things to come, right? So I always think about this with looking things up on WebMD, right? Oh, I woke up, I have a sore throat, what is it? Oh, it's cancer, right? Is somatization disorder is someone who believes that fully and then acts appropriately, right? So they wake up with a sore throat and they schedule an oncology appointment with a doctor, right? That's obviously a problem. It's not a healthy way to live, both in terms of the anxiety and depression that are associated with the belief of having a terminal illness, and also the time that it takes out of your life by going to all these specialists and for things that there's nothing physically wrong with you. On the other hand, there's conversion disorder, which is when you lose the ability to use some sort of part of your body, whether that's an arm, a leg, or even having issues with like your bowel movements, or holding your urine or something like that. That there's no physical cause, but there's some sort of psychological block that prevents someone from operating, right? So it's considered a psychosomatic disorder or somatoform disorder. And then the last one that we should mention are people who are hypochondriacs or who suffer from hypochondriasis. Um, this is when people just like are so preoccupied with their own health that leads to them getting sick, right? People who are so worried about getting a cold that they get a cold. And it's because of the stress that their body is under that then leads to them having the negative health outcome. Um, Hypochondriacs are people who just obsess about the smallest things, and kind of similar to somatization disorder. They think the worst, right? Everything is a catastrophe, and they need to go get the help that they think that they need. When in reality, there's nothing physically wrong with them. So I apologize for the length of this video. I know it's on the longer side. But in it, we covered a lot of things: dissociative identity disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and then the psychosomatic disorders as well. You'll notice, if you need a hint, that psychosomatic and somatoform both have the word soma in it, which we should remember from the bio unit means body, right? So psychosomatic, mind-body disorder, right? So there's nothing physically wrong with your body, but you feel like there is mentally. That's it for clinical psych part 1. We'll start videos covering treatment and how we should do treatment next time. So I will see you guys then.